All right. Well, welcome everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started. It's about 11:10. Um, First of all, thank you all for joining us today for this Disability Tapas presentation. And we're really excited to talk about this topic with you. As is mentioned in the chat there, we are having a live transcript basically generated during this presentation. And it's available for all our Tapas presentations. If you look on the top left of your Zoom window, you'll see that there's a live on otter.ai live notes button up there, a red button up there. And if you click that, you can choose to view the stream and it'll open up a separate window in your browser. So invite you guys, if you're interested in checking that out, to view that live transcript and see how accurate it is, and maybe give us some feedback at the end if it did pretty well or not. So always curious about that. But yeah, so today's topic, as I mentioned, we're doing how to be a disability ally, strategies for identifying and addressing ableism. My name is John Lee. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I'm an assistive technology specialist at the Disability Resource Center. I'll turn it over to Bailey.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bailey Hamblin. I'm an access specialist with the Disability Resource Center. Use they, she pronouns, and yeah, identify as being queer and genderqueer, as well as having some mental illnesses and chronic illnesses as well.
Great. Thanks, Bailey. So we're going to, actually, I'm going to do a new share here. And hold up. Just a second here. Hold on. Close out my PowerPoint for a second here. Okay. I want to show this. So many windows open here. Okay. Strange. Okay. All right, there we go. So wanted to start out with first having you guys take a couple minutes to consider what your thoughts are of disability, kind of how you frame it or how you conceive it. So I have a few questions here for you to just to ponder for a minute. How do you define disability? Do you think of it in a positive, negative, or neutral way? And then do you consider disability a form of diversity? So think about that for a couple of minutes. We're gonna talk about it during our presentation really from the perspective of disability as an identity, but keeping in mind that folks do conceive of it in a lot of different ways. So we just want to sort of give you that perspective today, and acknowledge that there are other perspectives, but that's the one we're choosing to frame disability as. But think about that from where you're coming from. One way to really look at how you may perceive disability is by taking a rather objective test. And you may be familiar of these implicit association tests done by Harvard University. They have a disability implicit association test, the DIAT, which you may or may not have heard of. And this is the most prominent implicit measure of disability attitudes, having been administered to over 38,500 participants through the open access project implicit study website alone. I've got the link up there that you can check out. And if you'd like to take that test, I put a couple notes here. You can proceed as a guest if you prefer not to create a free account. And then when you choose to take a test from the top menu, select Disability IAT from the list. And if you don't want to participate in the survey, you can certainly decline to answer. But I've got a slide here that just shows you a little bit of the instructions involved with the test, and you use the keys, the computer keys E and I, to categorize items into groups as fast as you can. And this test will measure your response time for that, as well as your exact responses, and determine a score on your implicit bias level in favor of or opposed to disability. So they have some categories here, and I'll read these out: glad, smiling, enjoy, pleasure, joyous, delight, adore, glorious. The bad category, which is poison, angry, detest, awful, evil, annoy, failure, selfish. And then they have some symbols for disabled persons and abled persons. So the disabled person symbols, they have some crutches, the standard universal symbol of a wheelchair, a guide dog, and a person walking with a white cane. And under abled person, they have, which essentially look like traffic signs. They have two folks walking, a person running, a person, I'm not sure what they're doing, and that other one walking by themselves, and then a skier. And there are 7 parts of the test, and what makes the test unique is that the instructions change for each part. So you do have to really pay attention. So here's a sample question. You can see at the top of the slide, the top left, it says press E for, and then in blue it says bad, or in green, abled persons. And then on the right, it says press I for good, which is blue, or disabled persons, which is green. And then in the middle of the slide, they have a picture of a person with a white cane. And if you make a mistake, a red X will appear. So they'll quickly flash these questions, and they'll change the pairing of bad or abled person, or good or disabled. Like sometimes they'll say bad or disabled person, or good or abled persons. So you have to respond kind of quickly, and that's how it kind of measures your level of implicit bias there. So I encourage you to take that test and see where you fall on that, and it will give you a score of um, like from minimal to you know a high level of bias kind of thing. It's kind of a continuum there. So as I mentioned earlier, Bailey and I are kind of presenting this presentation from the perspective of disability as an identity. And as we'll talk during this presentation, I think one thing you may realize yourselves is how often in your day-to-day lives and on campus or out in the community, how often you may not hear disability really discussed in that manner or included in discussions about different identities. Um, but we do want to emphasize a few points here, one of which is disability is the only form of identity that an individual can enter into suddenly and without consent. And that could be through injury, through illness. I mean, we've got the COVID-19 right now, which can have a disabling effect on individuals. And so, yeah, certainly in age, as you age, you can acquire disability. So, those are certain factors that can lead to that for anybody. And it spans all other forms of identity. It doesn't discriminate based on ethnicity, gender, religion, sexual orientation, or other identity factors. And as I mentioned, most people at some point will acquire a disability if you live long enough. And maybe even your status as being disabled can change throughout the lifespan. It's very fluid. So that's another important consideration. And as we talk about other forms of identity, another key point we want to bring up is that the importance of intersectionality when looking at disability, because of the fact that it doesn't discriminate on other, uh, with regards to other categories of people, then it's important to consider that it's not generally the case where you say somebody is only disabled. They may have other identities that intersect, and most often do. And then disability pride movements have gained less of a following than those of other marginalized groups. So I think we tend to maybe not associate pride with disability. That may be a very unique and unfamiliar concept. but it's a very real thing, and it's been around for a while. But again, it's not something that has gotten nearly as much press coverage or discussion in the mainstream at large. We're hoping to see that change, and I think it is changing. So, in addition to the idea of identity, and I guess sort of kind of in coordination with that, is this idea of the social model of disability. And again, we're talking about this perspective, but another perspective and the counter perspective that's most often seen in society is the medical model of disability, which is this idea of disability as a deficit, as something abnormal, and something that needs a cure. So, and that's very individual focused. You know, it basically holds the perspective that the problem resides in the individual, whereas the social model does the opposite. It really looks at the disability essentially, or the cause of disability, is residing outside of the individual. So in this case, oppression and disabling occurs by the environment, attitudes, and systems. So for example, in my case, I use a wheelchair. So if I can't get into a building due to it not having ramps, or I can't get around inside the building due to it not having elevators or wide enough hallways, the social model would say that's not my problem. That's the problem of the designer of the building, that it was not designed to be accessible. So as a result, I am disabled as a result of the inaccessibility of that building. And again, we can take that to attitudes and policies as well. So again, beginning to kind of look at things in our day-to-day life where where's the, where do we really see the barriers here? Is it the person's problem primarily, or is it really something that could have been designed differently, or an attitude or perspective that could have been different in interacting with an individual? And neurodiversity is neurological abilities exist on a spectrum and are recognized, respected, and valued. And you see this idea really promoted a lot in the autism community, and you'll hear that perspective of the same thing with disability pride in that community. And then a few other points here, and it's kind of related to what I've just spoken about. Disability studies is the examination of study of disability as a social, cultural, and political phenomenon. So that's again going counter to the traditional treatment of disability as a medical or rehabilitative state. And just to reiterate earlier what was said about disability is just part of the human experience. You know, presenting that idea of it's just a normal part of human diversity. Human beings are not perfect, and so there's a lot that can be learned from the fact that the human body and mind presents itself in a lot of different ways, and it's not necessarily in a negative fashion for that. And then, of course, disabilities being a source of pride and identity. So I'd like to show you this short video clip to hopefully illustrate that point in a way that kind of flips the script a little bit.
Imagine a town full of physically impaired people, all wheelchair users. They run everything. There aren't any able-bodied people, so naturally, when they built the town, the community decided it was pointless to have ceilings 10 foot high and doors 7 foot high. So the ceilings were built at 7 foot and the doors at 5 foot. In every way, they designed the place the way they wanted it. One day, a few able-bodied people come to stay. One of the first things they notice is the height of the doors. And the reason they notice is because they keep hitting their heads. They come to stand out by the bruises they carry on their foreheads. Soon doctors, psychiatrists and social workers all become involved. Committees are formed. Many people are worried about what becomes known as the problem of the able-bodied. Throughout the town there is a growth of real concern. Specially toughened helmets are handed out, free to the able-bodied, to be worn at all times. Braces are designed which give support and relief, while keeping the able-bodied wearer bent to normal height. Various groups of compassionate wheelchair users get together and form registered charities. Every quarter they have a collection day. Upturned helmets are left in pubs and shops for people to drop their small change into. There is talk of founding special homes. But then one day, it dawns on the able-bodied that there is nothing actually wrong with them, just that society excludes them.
Right. So I'm going to turn this over to my partner, Bailey.
Yeah, so we like that video. I think it just illustrates the social model of disability and how kind of like our environments are created around certain bodies and certain types of minds and ways of existing in the world versus, you know, the disability residing within the individual themselves. So to turn it over to the system of ableism, John and I really like this definition that I'll read from the graphic that's on the left-hand side. It defines ableism as a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, intelligence, excellence, and productivity. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, colonialism, and capitalism. This form of systemic oppression also leads to people in society determining who is valuable and worthy based on a person's appearance and or their ability to satisfactorily reproduce, excel, and behave. And to note that you don't have to be disabled to experience ableism. So a couple things we wanted to pull out of this definition is that the system of ableism is a system, right? So like other forms of oppression that we talk about, it's systemic, it's deeply rooted in, you know, our history, in our culture, in our society. It's pervasive in our attitudes, in the way, you know, our environments are physically built, in our policies, in our legislature. So just wanting to acknowledge that aspect of ableism. As the definition, you know, points to, it has roots in, especially, you know, the United States culture of capitalism and colonialism, you know, categorizing bodies and ranking bodies on different levels has been used as a tool of colonialism. When we look at, you know, science being used to, quote unquote, you know, prove that Black bodies are less than white bodies, you know, that's a form of ableism. Looking at the way, yeah, that women may or may not, you know, be able to contribute to capitalism and a society of productivity using their bodies, and, you know, the history of like hysteria and kind of that kind of stuff. That's all, those are examples of ableism at work kind of in the early history of our country. It also has these roots in our value as a society of individualism. So, you know, we're always taught to this American dream bootstraps mythology to lift ourselves up, to do everything kind of like on our own, and that is the goal in life, right, is to like own and do and produce individually, versus, you know, in the disability community, folks oftentimes have to rely on others to exist in the world and get the things that they need, and we don't seem to value that as much as individualism. And so how can we move out of that mindset? It's also linked with this, you know, the height of the Industrial Revolution, which was kind of, yeah, what triggered this focus on individualism and productivity, efficiency, competition with other people. So really like pushing that communal living to the side. Also wanting to reiterate that it assigns values to bodies. Rosemary Garland Thompson is a great disability studies scholar, and she defines these basically the standard body that we are asking folks to like live up to in terms of productivity and normalcy as the normate. So what are we considering as the normal, quote unquote, body? And how are we pushing other bodies and minds, you know, to the margins? In that same regard, you know, what is considered the opposite of the normate is the disabled body. It's treated as something, you know, John mentioned earlier, something to be feared and pitied, fixed, cured, hidden, or even removed. And we'll talk about some of the implications during COVID. John and I were talking the other day about how, you know, folks are needing to stay indoors and socially isolate, and we're asking, you know, folks with disabilities, folks who are not wanting to, you know, abide by those kind of mandates that have been put out. We're asking disabled folks and people that are at higher risk to hide themselves, to stay, you know, inside, away from us, so that we, you know, can continue existing in our lives without wanting to face this community and these folks. Also treating, you know, the disabled body as a problem and defective and a deviation from this norm. This system is pervasive and also paternalistic. So we often have the tendency within the system of ableism to look down on disabled bodies, to treat disabled folks as if they're not capable of making their own decisions and living their own lives, that they need some sort of assistance or almost a form of like saviorism. And the next slide talks about a couple just different types of ableism. So I had mentioned it being pervasive and just different types. But when we're looking at how that kind of gets created, we can look at these different aspects of society. So our environments are, the physical world that we exist in, barriers that exist there, things not being wheelchair accessible, things not, being adjustable to different heights, those kind of things. We can also look at social barriers, which kind of ties in with attitudinal barriers. So what are the attitudes that we've learned, that we've been taught from a young age to believe about folks with disabilities? What are our internal prejudices towards disability? We might also look at the legal, like I said, legislative policy barriers, language barriers, myths, and misinformation. So I think sometimes when we talk about ableism and we talk about making things more accessible, oftentimes our first thought is, oh, well, as long as the building itself is accessible, as long as folks can physically get there, then it's good enough, right? I've seen more and more conversations come in about, ASL translators and that kind of stuff. So I think language is being talked about a little bit more, but we do want to acknowledge that there's all these different aspects of society that ableism can exist within, and that's what makes it so, systemic and pervasive. Yeah. So the next slide talks about, I don't know, John, if you wanted to start the conversation about this one, just wanting to get us thinking, about some of the ways that we've seen ableism manifest in our society, given all the stuff that's going around now.
Definitely. Thanks, Bailey. And yeah, I think, and this is one we kind of also open up to our participants here, if anybody wants to chime in either via voice or through the chat. But some examples of ableism that you've noticed in the media or in your community in response to this pandemic crisis. And we have a quote here that I saw in a recent online article in Colorado about a cafe in Colorado that opened on Mother's Day, and it was packed. They said, "Oh, it's the busiest Mother's Day we've ever had here." And I mean, it was, there's no social distancing, nobody was wearing masks, and so the patrons spoke out. And here's a quote from Linda Chatili. I'm not afraid to be out. I'm not going to wear a mask. I'm healthy. I'm in good shape, and I don't think it's as serious as they say. The communities are being devastated. People are losing everything. They should have never shut anybody down. And I have in bold here, they should have told all the old ones, parentheses people, and all the ones that don't have the right immune systems to stay home and let people do their jobs. People are being devastated. So, on the one level, certainly there's this, as this message communicates, a almost further marginalization of people who have underlying conditions, or older folks even, who are seen as, who's basically are essentially being devalued. They don't contribute to society. They need to essentially get out of the way and let society continue as quote unquote normal. So you see a lot of that talk right now going on. We see that I'm sure a lot of you have heard about it, the essential workers that are keeping things going are largely, they're disproportionately.
Just get the presentation face on.
Say again?
That was my brother, sorry.
Oh, okay. I thought somebody was saying something. Okay, good. So, especially people of color in various communities are make up a smaller percentage of the population, but a larger percentage of those being infected with COVID, and other communities like in Oklahoma. We're hearing about Native Indigenous folks who are high numbers of incidents of COVID, and those numbers aren't even being reported. So again, if we're looking at ableism from the standpoint of marginalized individuals, marginalized groups, you can see the effects there. But curious to hear from the audience any thoughts on what you've noticed, maybe particularly ableism as it might affect people with underlying conditions or older adults, and both in communications that you're hearing in the media or in public. So we want to give kind of a moment or two for anybody that might want to to chime in. And Bailey, that goes for you too. If you've noticed anything in particular that you want to share with the group.
I think that there's been like this huge, and I think we see this a lot in like all forms of like social justice when we talk about it, but especially with COVID-19, that there's been a huge sense of like fairness, or like what's fair for each person. But I think what people forget when they're talking about fairness is that it's also not fair that someone has an autoimmune disorder, or that it's not fair that they have these like these immune, you know. And so like talking about fairness of like, do these essential people have to go into work, or all of these things. And so I think that just taking a step back and thinking of like these things that are put into place of like these accommodations, that actually is making it fair, that
Right.
those accommodations are like helping level the playing field. And so that's where I get so fired when people are just like, it's not fair that you're making these accommodations for these people. It's just like, no, actually, that is making it fair.
Right. That's a very good point. Thank you.
That's a great point that ties into John and I were having a conversation yesterday about, yeah, these things that people are being asked to do, and people are seeing it as like an affront to their like individual liberties and rights. And it ties in with this notion of valuing individualism over interdependence and like communal aid, mutual aid and communal living and all that kind of stuff too. So it's a great point.
Definitely. And
go
ahead. Sorry.
Hey,
No,
John.
Yes.
I was just in a conversation where that was evoked, where the sense that with the fall announcement, that the fact that some staff are coming back and may not want to, and they have telecommuting options, which you know, will likely employ, but we're looking to our staff who are getting the it was called VPAL, now it's TLP. Anyway, so the paid administrative leave if you're in a vulnerable category. And said the exact same thing, that's not fair that they get that and we don't. It's like, sorry,
Right.
it's not fair that we're protecting folks. I also wanted to share, you know, I'm kind of like these, it's the protesters that have been out protesting stay-at-home orders.
Yes.
Freedom. And then one of the large ones in California, it was just on their website, and their kind of tagline, I'm going to read it aloud. It says, "The elderly, sick, and high risk are encouraged to quarantine, while the healthy and the able have a right to to live their lives." So I feel like pulling on this ableist language of, you know, you all stay home,
right,
we're gonna go live our life, and without any regard of like it just I thought that was a really good bad example in the media.
That's a great example. Thank you for sharing that. That illustrates it really well. It's almost like this idea of institutionalization, you know, like just, you know, keep them, you know, they're safe, but out of sight, out of mind, because we've got, you know, the business of getting America great again, to getting America going again. And you know, this idea too, you brought up the telecommuting, which is really interesting, and that's another thing that I think out of this crisis that we're seeing so much more, obviously, telecommuting taking place, and this is something that a lot of disabled folks have been requesting for years and have repeatedly been denied, or it's been, you know, discarded as not, well, we can't do that. That's not feasible. That's not, and we're of course finding that it is feasible. And so you see how sometimes when something becomes a necessity for everybody, it becomes all of a sudden possible. But if it's only for a marginalized or minority group, it's less of a priority. So we can see some of these. There's certainly some silver linings to this for people with disabilities, but there are some very troubling things that are being revealed, as you just pointed out, Carrie. So thank you for that. So yeah, we'll continue moving on, but feel free, you know, towards the end, if we have some time, hopefully, to share any other thoughts that you may have about that. So I'm going to turn this back over to Bailey again to continue on with how we identify ableism.
Yeah, I think one of the great ways to try to identify ableism is to take a look at your own privilege. And of course, you know, you can have a form of privilege even though you hold other identities. You know, you might be marginalized in certain ways and you might hold privilege in certain other identities. So just really quick, you know, want to kind of recap, you know, how privilege works. Some thoughts about it is that it's not quote unquote like your fault. We always talk about privilege as being an these unearned you know, systemic benefits that you get from the system that you're born into that values certain bodies and minds and identities and races over others. In and of itself, it's not a terrible thing and it doesn't make you a terrible person. And just about everybody has some form of privilege within certain, you know, identities that they hold. Talking about privilege, you know, it's not an accusation or an attempt to blame folks that do have privilege, but rather when we have this discussion, we can see it as an invitation to view your experiences in a new light and in the light of other folks. And I think that's great when we're talking about this aspect of interdependence and communal living. How can we look at the way that our lives, you know, impact other folks and the ways that we can use our lives and our powers and our instances of privileges to lift others up. So in these next two slides, we have some example of non-disabled or able privilege that I'll just kind of read out loud to get you folks thinking about. These are from Lydia XZ Brown, is a great disability studies scholar, activist. They identify as being autistic, and so some of their examples are from that lens of autism and neurodiversity. And I encourage you, we can send out in the chat as well the full list of them. It reminds me of Peggy McIntosh's Unpacking the White Knapsack, if anybody's read that, she goes through and lists some examples of her white privilege. So some examples we have here is I can choose to sit anywhere I want whenever I go out to an event, restaurant, movie theater, religious service, etc. I can read pretty much any book available in any library or bookstore in a format I can use, or, you know, looking at finding accessible material. I thought this one was interesting, you know, when we talked about the fires and stuff. Was that earlier this year? If the power goes out, I can still breathe. Other people automatically respect, validate, and understand my form of communicating instead of denying or dismissing it as not real or legitimate. On the next slide, we have people assume that I am able to have and express romantic and sexual desire with potential intimate partners. If I have internet access and want to go on the internet, I can access all of the material on pretty much any website. My type of body or brain is not used as a metaphor for brokenness, awfulness, mediocrity, or ignorance. And the public doesn't generally consider me dangerous and likely to become violent solely because I am neurotypical, or you can read that as disabled in general. So hopefully using some of these as a jumping off place to kind of like examine your own able-bodied or non-disabled privilege. And again, you might hold certain identities. And I think even within the disability community itself, you know, you can hold certain privileges in regard to being abled or non-disabled in certain ways and not other ways. So very like nuanced, but I think that's when we're looking at finding examples of ableism, that's a great place to start, is just considering the ways that you exist within the world in a more privileged light and not having to think or worry about some of these things.
Great. So I'm going to just go over some of the disability stereotypes that many of these you're probably familiar with, or maybe hadn't thought of them as these categories. But once you're aware of it, you'll probably start to see it everywhere. So just 6 really common ones, and again, a lot of these too we're exposed to through the media, through advertising, through the movies, through television, and so forth, especially when we have limited contact with people with visible disabilities at the very least. So one being, they are others, in quotes, partial, limited, less than fully human, unable, or they are superhuman, overcoming odds to live a normal life. The burden of disability is unending. They must rely on support. The disability is a sickness needing to be fixed or cured. We talked about earlier about the medical model, very, very pervasive. People with disabilities, especially psychological disabilities, are a menace to themselves and society, the villain that must be killed or controlled. How often have you heard that stereotype used, almost a scapegoat, with mass shootings, right? People with disabilities, especially cognitive disabilities, are innocents who inspire others to value life. So just a few images we're just going to go through really quickly, some common ones. Attitudes are the real disability. Your excuse is invalid. As you may know, invalid, when pronounced invalid, is another rather derogatory term used for disability. Limitations live only in our minds, and there's an individual bilateral amputee wearing prosthetic legs, doing a long jump. Disability with the word or the letters dis crossed out. Run for kids who can't. And then my favorite shows a man in a wheelchair, seated in a wheelchair, but his shadow is standing up, right? Because that's everybody's dream. And then some from the comic book world. There's an image here of Captain Hook, a very, an amputee with a hook, a villain. Then this one is disturbing. This parking space, this ad that's been built on a disabled parking space. Every 48 seconds, a drunk driver makes another person eligible to park here. Wow. And then this one with Professor Xavier from X-Men. One of the little thought bubbles says, "Is there a chance for me? Will I never walk again? I can't accept that fate. I can't. While I'm confined to this wheelchair, a hopeless cripple." So again, think about folks that read this, especially children, and they see that messaging. We're going to share, by the way, this PDF of this presentation later. And so rather than show this a video clip just in the interest of time, we'll invite you to view this at your leisure when we share the presentation. And then just wanted to share some microaggressions. A lot of these phrases are ones I've personally heard and will often hear on sometimes even a daily basis, although not as much lately since I'm not out and about. But when I am, especially at the grocery store, it seems like I'll hear things like, "Slow down, Turbo, or I'll have to give you a ticket." It's good to see you people out and about. If you don't mind my asking, what's your disability? And this is like somebody I don't even know coming up to me saying this. What's wrong with you? You should try this remedy strategy. It worked for me and will probably work for you. Often said by a person who doesn't have the disability. I know what it's like to be in a wheelchair. I broke my leg once and was in a wheelchair for 6 weeks. It was terrible. What does he or she want? The server asking a companion of a disabled person at a restaurant. It must be nice getting special treatment. Or this one, I can't tell you how many times I've heard this. If we provide this, parentheses, provide some accommodation for you, we have to do it for everyone. And the old, "I'm only going to be a minute," when someone parks illegally in a disabled space. Or the classic, "I never see any disabled people come into my substitute business establishment. I wonder why." Why? Because it's not accessible. Yay, you did it. This kind of cheerleading a disabled person for doing something that's just an everyday task. And then that, some form of equal access, is going to create extra work for me, and I don't have enough time, energy, or resources. So again, the whole idea of the burden. And again, this is a great, this concept that you may have heard of, inspiration porn. And fortunately, more and more people are seeing this video, TED Talk by Stella Young. Many of you may have seen it already, called "I'm Not Your Inspiration, Thank You Very Much." Stella was a disabled rights advocate, activist, sadly deceased a couple years ago. Great comedian, actor, and highly recommend checking out her TED Talk. But she coined that term, inspiration porn, which basically is anything, a story, a video, a movie, whatever, what have it, an ad that characterizes a disabled person as courageous, brave, overcoming their disability. We see this a lot on popular media. I'm sorry, popular media, social media, otherwise known as popular media. Frequently things that get shared because they're kind of feel good, right? They're inspirational, so to speak. The problem is they often objectify the disabled person for the benefit of others, sometimes for the benefit of other disabled people. and it has the effect of othering people with disabilities. So we want to emphasize while it's okay to be inspired by something that someone does, unfortunately, inspiration porn has just become a trope. It's overdone. It almost dominates any kind of depiction of disability in social media and media at large. So we kind of need to rein that back and have more authentic, real stories, as opposed to those that seem to just kind of be intended to tug at the heartstrings or portray people as one of the stereotypes mentioned earlier. So I'm going to turn it over to Bailey.
Yeah, so I think, in unpacking some of those examples of microaggressions, we can see how ableism manifests itself through language. And I think that is something that we can consider. Those are small steps that we can take within our own lives, is to examine our own language and how we are choosing to talk about disability, to talk about folks with disabilities, or even just talk about things in general when we use these euphemisms for disability, when we use disability language to describe other things. So a couple things to consider within our own language. One, I wanted to note, this conversation between person first or identity first language. So folks will often get tripped up of like, oh, well, do I say it's a disabled person or a person with a disability? What is, correct? And I think just wanting to acknowledge that within the disability community itself, that conversation is being had and people prefer different ways of being identified. So there's been kind of this resurgence within the autistic community of identifying as autistic versus having autism or being on the autism spectrum, so the kind of motivation for identifying one way or the other is how far do you want to be removed from your disability. So if you say, I am a person with this disability or a person with a disability, that slightly removes the disability from you. And some people prefer that. I am a person, but I also happen to have this thing, versus, identity first being an autistic person. Some people are really embracing that as like, no, this disability is part of who I am. It makes up who I am. Without it, I would not be the same person. And so I want to embrace that and, use that first. So just wanting to note that there's neither way is necessarily correct, but that folks have different motivations for wanting to be identified certain ways and to identify themselves in certain ways. Wanting to note this slight use of different language of saying non-disabled versus able-bodied. We've kind of used both in some of the slides, and I think again you can get different preferences, but the term able-bodied is slightly problematic in that it implies that whatever is the deviation from able bodies is not able. So disabled folks are not able-bodied in any way. And I think if you talk to folks with disabilities, we find ourselves to be able in a lot of different ways, or our abilities might just look different from folks that don't have the same disabilities as us. So wanting to reconsider some language there. Other things that we might want to just keep an eye out for in our own language and the languages of others, like I said, able-bodied or differently able, non-able-bodied, things that are kind of euphemisms for disability. I think there's been, again, this resurgence in using the word disability and disabled, trying to bring that more to the forefront and treating it less as this like shameful, dirty word that we're not supposed to use. So any of these things that are, like I keep saying, euphemisms for disability, trying to lessen the impact of it, right? Avoiding saying afflicted with, stricken from, suffers from, victim of. I think we get into that language a lot when it comes to illness. Avoiding the words defect, abnormality, deformity, handicapped. Speaking to what John was talking about with inspiration porn, overusing, these adjectives of courageous or brave, or they overcome something to describe folks with disabilities. Also talking about special needs. I don't know if folks have sent, and maybe we can send it with a PowerPoint, but there's a kind of humorous video that exists, folks with Down syndrome talking about their special needs, and they say, oh, well, it would be a special need if I think one of the examples is like, if I needed a celebrity to wake me up in the morning every day. So instead we can say functional needs. So what are the needs that you have to function on a daily basis, to function within society? They aren't special needs in any way. They're just the needs that you have to function, right? again, kind of avoiding wheelchair bound, confined to a wheelchair. Speaks to one of the images that John had put up, with the shadow standing in the background. A lot of times assistive technologies, such as, wheelchairs and canes and different things like that, give folks with disabilities more freedom in their life. It allows them to go more places, to do more things. And so folks will not see those as something that they're bound to or confined to. It's actually very, helpful for them. And then kind of along with this image that's on the right, not using mental disorders as adjectives, saying I'm crazy or I'm insane or I'm OCD when you're just describing kind of nuances within your own personality or behaviors that you have. I think that's very stigmatizing for folks with mental illnesses. And then on the next slide, we have some other examples as well. Also just wanting to plug, again, Lydia XZ Brown within this link here, and we'll send out the slides. They've got a great list of different language considerations, and this image here, says say this and not that. So instead of insane, crazy, psycho, we might say unreal or unbelievable or awful or bad. Just to give you some, things to swap out, some alternatives to look at the ways that you might remove some of that ableist language from your vocabulary. And then kind of diving into, and John will talk about ways that we can address ableism, but I think a lot of us, working in higher education, we might consider the ways that we see ableism manifest itself on a college campus and within college culture itself. I think it's an interesting time to talk about right now, as we've discussed, the speed at which certain accommodations have been able to be created and to put in place, because it's starting to impact more people than just disabled folks now. But if we look at college culture, we might consider certain policies that exist. So attendance policies, very strict attendance policies, or no technology in the classroom policies. How are those things manifestations of some forms of ableism? And it's very limiting to the ways in which students can participate in academics. Of course, we can look at the buildings and campus designs. How are those inaccessible in certain ways? Different programs and events we have. I know in the chat, we mentioned my past tapas about making programming more accessible. We also might look at the mindsets that kind of exist within college culture, like who is eligible to come to campus, who is eligible to kind of stay here and make it here. What are the expectations that we have for the bodies and minds of our students, and how is that not very open and inclusive? Which ties into this, myths of college participation and access. Who has historically been able to come to college and have the stamina to, be in the quarter system, to get done in 4 years. I think we're in an exciting time right now where we can kind of reconsider some of those things. Yes, and so John will chat about some additional ways that you can kind of address ableism in your life, and real tools that we can have to be implementing.
Yeah, thanks, Bailey. And we'll go through these kind of quickly. I know we're coming up on the top of the hour, but we just have about nine kind of ways for you to start addressing ableism in your area. So one being increasing your understanding of disability as a social construct and familiarize yourself with the barriers to participation for people with disabilities. So we've got at the end of our slides here, again, this can go out in a PDF of some great folks to follow on social media in the area of disability rights and disability justice. Using inclusive language, as Bailey just mentioned, avoiding ableist terms and looking at some alternatives. I like this ableist jar idea. If you go to that website, it's the idea of each time you use one of those more ableist terms, you contribute $1 and it can actually go to a good cause. Spotlighting and amplifying disabled voices, disability culture, and hot button disability issues in social media and in your areas of participation and influence. So if you're a professor, finding ways to talk about disability in the classroom, and not just about disability from a diagnosis standpoint, but those disability social issues. Talking about it in relation to COVID, like we were doing, or anything else. Where does disability fit in your curriculum? And if it's not being talked about, ask yourself why not. Include disability and diversity-related dialogues, initiatives, activities, and events. Similar to, certainly what Bailey talked about with accessible events, but making sure disability is seen as a form of diversity and included in the discussions. Making accessibility a forethought, so in the physical and digital realm, events and activities. using a universal design or inclusive design approach, calling out microaggressions and barriers, this idea of see something, say something, and celebrate and support efforts to foster accessibility and inclusion for folks with disabilities. You know, one of the big things that is we need allies, and I think members of other groups would say the same thing. It's often, if not as effective, more effective when an ally speaks up about something, because then other folks notice, hey, you know, this is affecting a lot of people, not just some small minority group that I may assume it's a small impact. It's a lot bigger than that. So allies can play such an important role. Consider where policies and practices in your areas might be biased towards able-bodiedness, able-mindedness, and brainstorm ways to update those. Bailey talked about attendance policies, technology use in the classroom. Take to heart the disability mantra, nothing about us without us, when planning and creating anything that may affect people with disabilities. So make sure you're including people with disabilities in the dialogue and letting them lead the efforts whenever possible. And then recognizing your able privilege. There's a link to the Lydia X.E. Brown able privilege checklist to look at. So take those, maybe look at a few of those strategies and look where you can apply those in your personal work, school, and life today and in the coming weeks over the next year. And reach out, collaborate with others with and without disabilities, and or join efforts that are already in place. And then these are some great ones that have been compiled. Bailey's put a lot of these together. Some folks on social media we recommend checking out. And a lot of these folks represent the disability justice movement, which really emphasize intersectionality between different marginalized groups. So there's a lot of great conversations out there, a lot of great podcasts and YouTubes. The information's out there. It's just a matter of seeking it out and expanding your mind a little bit. And Bailey put together this great list of books as well. And so feel free to reach out to us for, I put my email in there if you'd like a copy of this presentation. We'll send out a PDF to you. And if you have any other questions or thoughts, we encourage you to reach out, any other ideas you have. And at this time, we'd like to, it's right about 12. So if anyone wants to stick around to ask some questions, I'm willing to hang out for a little longer. Bailey, if you are too. Otherwise, thanks again for coming. And hope you picked up something today and can take that out and spread the word. Take care, everybody. Stay safe and be well.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.